Ben, thanks very much. So I've been asked to talk to you today about transformation and adaptation. And basically, if I want to distinguish the two, I would suggest that transformation is planned military change, adaptation is reactive military change. And so let's start with a definition, being a good academic. Transformation is a program of large-scale military change based on synergies of new technology, concepts, and structures. We'll all know that we're thinking here about the US-led transformation starting in the very late 1990s. And it is itself, of course, a response to socio-technological and strategic change of the late 20th century. And like transformation in air, land, and sea warfare of the 1930s and 40s, we're talking here about a program of military change that starts in peacetime but matures in wartime. In the current military transformation, there are three elements. There's the integration of information and communications technology. Secondly, there's the development of effects-based thinking about operations. And thirdly, there's restructuring and equipping for expeditionary operations. Now, I know transformation's gone out of fashion, and General Mattis had some hand in that. So where are we with transformation? Is it just a damp squid, to use the term of the day, or is there something deeper? And I actually co-led a rather large project on this from 2007 to 2009, part of which is we surveyed the officer cadets of the NATO College. These are lieutenant colonel and majors. We surveyed 2,464 of them, and we asked them about transformation. I mean, for a start, if you're talking about a program of military change, you'd want to have your officer corps buying into it, because if they don't buy into it, it's not going to happen. What we found was quite surprising, actually. We asked them, how many of you think there's a need for radical change? 64%. How many of you think that your militaries are undertaking major change? 60%. How many of you think that ITC will profoundly change the conduct of operations out to 2020? 86%. We asked them a second time of that question. We rephrased it. We asked it 14 questions later, just to double check. How many of you think IT networks will be the most important asset in 2020? That's 74%. How about future operations being effects-based? 86% believe they will be. How about the application of military force will remain as important in 2020, as it is today? Only 46%. Although, interestingly, the Brits, of which there were only 146 respondents, felt that would be 71%. So the view among officers within NATO in 2008 was transformation was happening. No doubts about that. And this is how they saw the future of warfare out to 2020. And then, of course, as you might expect, being good academics, we did a lot of detailed case study work looking down into the various militaries. And at the time, there was a dominant notion, you may know, called the transformation gap. Beware the gap. The Americans were transforming well ahead of everyone else, and the Europeans were racing to catch up. And indeed, that was the case. But what we found was that within Europe, there are many transformation gaps. You found, for instance, the Germans well ahead of most other nations on doctrinal change, but way behind most others on technology. You found the French well ahead of many others in technological change, but actually they weren't changing their doctrine very much. They didn't really buy into a lot of the transformation rhetoric as they saw it. And indeed, if you look at the British, of all the militaries, if you looked at a genuine attempt to achieve both doctrinal and technological change, it's the British who attempt that in the most genuine way. And though, interestingly, across the board, as many military people in the room will realize, everyone was going medium weight. Everybody was looking at expeditionary capability. And the shadow of defense cuts was hanging over most nations, especially some like the Dutch. So the European militaries were transforming at different rates, in different ways, but the dominant view among the military officers, the mid-rank military officers, was transformation was coming. Now, the language has changed. We don't tend to talk about transformation so much, but the underlying major thrusts of transformation have not changed. The move towards information networking, the way of thinking about operations and planning in terms of effects, we might not use the language, but that's what's happening, actually, and the development of expeditionary capability. And then to answer one of the key exam questions of today, has the British Army itself transformed? Well, let's look at three wayward points: 1998, 2003, 2010. 1998, SDR kicks off the whole thing, kicks off the beginning of the move towards the medium weight, and the requirement for the British Army to be able to project power globally as part of a shift within NATO towards a global security role. Well, a few years later, in 2003, the Defence White Paper sets out transformation a la American lines: network-enabled capability instead of NCW, effects-based planning and operations, and the need to develop rapidly deployable forces. At the time, the Army was thinking of FAS, as we know, Future Army Structures, and FRES. Where are we 7 years later in 2010, at the time of the national SDSR? Well, there's no doubt there's been a spectacular improvement in the development of NEC, both in ISTAR, especially in ISTAR, and looking in theatre, especially with data collection. There's no doubt, as most of you realise, data exploitation still remains a problem. Bandwidth is a problem in theatre. Connectivity within networks is a problem. Bowman CIP has not delivered everything. But look at where we've come in 7 years. It's quite spectacular. Look also in terms of all the problems with the comprehensive approach, all those kinds of problems that we know, and the problems with doctrine, which has been quite cumbersome and slow, is the reality. But look what's happened in theatre. And in theatre, in terms of how brigades have been thinking about their operations and the level of integration with the civilian partners in theatre over time, it's quite spectacular. There's no doubt that people are doing effects-based thinking, right actually from company level up. And look at also expeditionary capability of the British Army. I think the British Army has proven that in spades, that it has developed the expeditionary capability in terms of what it's projected into Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, as you expect, FRES hasn't delivered. Well, it really wasn't configured to do so. But instead, we've been using the UAV the Urgent Operation Requirement process to kit out the Army for expeditionary operations. But that is the British way of warfare. The British way of warfare is not the indirect approach. The British way of warfare is underspend, underinvest, and then when a war comes along, tip stuff in, get the army out there, and then get them kitted up. The British way of warfare is doing things on the cheap, and then making good when you have to. But you compare where the British Army has come over this period, where the French and the German armies are, and I can go into detail. Suffice to say, the British Army has clearly transformed. So adaptation. Adaptation, in contrast, is reactive change. Adaptation is the term of the day. So scholars, perhaps much like military folk, transformation's out of fashion with us, adaptation's in fashion. Everyone's writing articles and books about adaptation. I even saw a book called A Revolution in Military Adaptation. I just thought that was a contradiction, but there you go. Adaptation for me is reactive change. It's an activity that occurs on operations. It's driven by operational challenges and campaign pressures. So it's in contrast with managed programs of change, such as transformation of the early 2000s. Adaptation is about refining, calibrating, correcting programs of managed change. It's what happens when you get into war and you realize your managed program of change isn't going to get you where you need. That's transformation and contact. Of course, it can occur at two levels. Most obviously, at the tactical level, it's the normal business of militaries when they go to war, as they start adapting, almost from the get-go. And they can adapt in two ways. They can exploit core competencies. That's a routine military business. But if that doesn't work, then you have to explore new ways and means of doing things. And I'll elaborate that in a second. It can also occur at the second level, at the strategic level, which is when the national command has to adjust strategy or resources in response to operational and political feedback loops. Let's look at Afghanistan then, to just briefly illustrate these 2 points. What you actually see in Afghanistan on the part of the British Armed Forces is vigorous adaptation at the tactical level. Even if you take the charge up the valley by 16 Brigade, that's a form of adaptation. They had to adapt very quickly to circumstances on the ground, and they pulled themselves off the Joint Helmand Plan. And you also look at the first 18 months, which was a period of intense fighting by 16-3 and 12 Brigade. In each case, the brigades adapted to what they saw were the mistakes of the brigade before them. The point is, by the way, it is yet to be proven that what happened, what those brigades did, was in fact an error at the time. It is yet to be proven that we did. I mean, I'm as yet not convinced that it is the case that we could have avoided a period of quite intense fighting. And not necessarily because we were resisting the resurgent Taliban, but because that was necessary to remove Sher Mohammad Akhundzada from power. That was the cost that we were going to have to pay in order to neutralize his militia. Anyway, but what you also saw from 2007 onwards is, so I would argue, exploitation of core competencies in the first 18 months as the British Army tried to, and the Royal Marines tried to defeat the rising insurgency and SMA's militia. But then you saw from late 2007 onwards a period of exploration by the British military in theatre. And there's lots of evidence of this, whether you talk about NCETs and TCAF, which I know was abandoned then picked up again, district stabilisation teams, the civil military mission in Helmand, but also counter-ID and ISTAR. There's just lots of evidence of adaptation, lots and lots. But that's nothing to be, that's to be proud of, but it's nothing exceptional. All militaries adapt when they're put under pressure. But what you see is very poor adaptation at the strategic level. I mean, just shockingly poor adaptation by national command authorities. And that's down to senior leadership not focused on Afghanistan. It's down to Prime Ministers Blair and Brown having attention focused close at home, i.e. very close to home in terms of their own political position, and a succession of Secretary of States for Defence. And that has very adverse impact on campaign coherence, as we know. I mean, the problem everyone's recognised is this problem of continuity of approach in theatre by British brigades. But the question becomes, why wasn't there more stronger direction down the command chains, the national and ISAF command chains, to stop that? And I think you do see it stopped, in a sense, when Combined Joint Task Force 6 stands up. And with IJC standing behind it and General McChrystal, you see much more direction driven down the ISAF chain. And that's what drives coherence into the campaign, and not down through the national command chain. So there's an interesting question. And that gets me to my conclusion, because that is directly relevant to where we are today. The 2 points I would end on are, firstly, the national security strategy has adopted a strategic posture of adaptable Britain. Well, the lesson of Afghanistan is the one area where Britain was not adaptable was at the strategic level. And it seems to me, if you follow the logic of what I say, which is adaptation is something that you do in wartime on operations, the idea of adaptable Britain as a post-Afghanistan posture for peacetime is deeply problematic. The thing is, militaries and defence ministries face few pressures to adapt in peacetime. When you adapt, it's what do you adapt to? Well, the question is answered in operations by what's thrown in front of you. But in peace, it's not there. It seems to me that adaptable Britain has been adopted as the strategic posture because it really means for ministers asking the military to do more with less. If, however, we're going to realize this, then it seems to me you have to improve the strategy-making machinery in government. And that both involves the civil-military domain, but also the multilateral domain within the NATO framework, because the NAC was no better at strategy-making. We only see, in fact, a strategy for Afghanistan when America under Obama turns its attention to it. The second and final point is, however, it is possible to improve the adaptability of the British Army for future operations. I think the British Army has proven itself to be very adaptable, but one could improve on it. There is a point that everyone's made, but it's a consistent theme since 1998 that we're now in a joint interagency multilateral environment. That's a given. But there's 2 points here, I think. First is, and here it's building on a theme in the Defence Green Paper of 2010. The Defence Green Paper talks about adaptability and agility. The two things go together. Agility is a quality of your force structure and force posture. Adaptability is what you do with it when you get into operations. And it seems to me you can improve agility by improving the agility to generate force packages in a bespoke manner for the operations that you face. And then, this is the final point, you need to improve adaptability. And you improve adaptability by anticipating the 4 Rs. And they are the possible and probable need to reinforce, reconfigure, re-roll, or reconstitute capability. I mean, we send half of 16 in 2006, and they encounter all sorts of problems. And if you had anticipated these 4 Rs, you wouldn't have negotiated an agreement with the Treasury to say this is all the commitment we're going to throw in and that's it. Instead, you would have said this is what we're going to throw in initially, but we expect to have to put more in. And whether it involves simply reinforcing, or possibly having to reconfigure, as happened in Bosnia in 1994, or indeed re-rolling, or possibly even reconstituting some capability, those are things you need to be prepared for. Thank you.